Hey everybody, so we're making a very pink tote bag today. It's my sister's birthday and she loves pink more than anything else in the world, so pink tote bag it is. So we're going to get into, I'm going to show you how to draw up a little pattern for a tote bag in any size you want, and then we're going to go through making them. They're pretty simple, so let's get into it. All right, so this is our design. Tote bags are fairly simple to make a little pattern for. So this is kind of how I want it to look. So it's going to have two little handles here, and it's going to be fairly small. It's not going to be like a massive tote or anything like that. So the pattern, when you're making the pattern, right? So you pick your dimensions. So we're going to go 13 inches wide by 9 inches tall. Then you pick how deep you want it to be. That's going to be your kind of gusset size. We're not doing a full gusset around, but so I'm going to do 4 inches. And of course there's going to be a seam up the side, and then I'm doing this all in one piece because we have a nice, I think this is a shoulder. So the way that you do this is you take your body, so 13 inches across by 9 inches deep. Then you add how wide you want it to be, 4 inches, and that's going to be kind of your center section. That's going to be the bottom of your bag. Then you just add the second 13 by 9 here, right? You add all that up and put it together. Your little flaps here, you want these to be half the width of your gusset. So these are going to be 2 inches each because they're going to kind of fold in. And that's your pattern pretty much. So I'm going to cut this out. Probably just going to use a pencil on the back of this because all these seams are going to be hidden, and we'll get into it, but that's pretty much how you make a really simple custom tote bag pattern at home. There isn't much more to it than that. So I'm going to use just a straight edge and kind of draw this pattern on the back of this leather. I need 9, 9, and 4, so 18, 22. This is a 2-foot long straight edge, so I'm going to give myself a little bit of space, maybe a 1/4 inch from the edge of the hide so that I can trim. And I'm just going to give myself one straight line. And now this line is going to be what we use. We're going to work off of this for everything else. So now this is an old ruler that doesn't have any markings left on it. So now I'm going to measure from this baseline the depth of my bag, which is going to be 13 inches. Now an important thing with this is, I learned this in design school, and I argued with my professor about it forever, but it's very true, and it makes sense. I was just being a kid that thought he was right all the time. But you need 3 marks to make a straight line. So we're going to measure 3 marks at 13 inches from our baseline down, and that way we can take our other straight edge again, and then we can make our second line, and we know that these are going to be parallel, and our bag is going to be 13 inches across the whole way. So next we've got to make our right angle, and without any guidelines here, I'm sure there are other ways to do this. I just take a piece of cover stock. It's like thick computer paper. I figure that's a right angle. It'll be good enough for us. And so I make my guideline like this, and then just go in and finish it with our straight edge, which we know is very straight. And that is how I've gotten very workable right angles for as long as I've been making tote bags. And now we need to measure, basically do the same thing. We need to measure 22 inches from this over to the other side. And we want 3 marks to make our straight edge. So if we look at our pattern, we have a 9 inch, a 9 inch, and a 4 inch in the middle. So I'm going to measure down 9 inches on either side. I'm going to use this ruler though, because the other one is all worn away. And again, I'm going to measure right up against my edge here. Then I'm going to go down the other side and measure 9 inches here. And now we're going to be a little bit, it's going to be a little different with this because I don't want to put any pencil marks in the middle of the bag that you could see when it's finished. So I'm actually going to do 4 marks, and I'm just going to make sure that my marks are inside, because this is going to be 2 inches deep, and I'm going to put my marks within 2 inches of the edge so that it'll essentially be cut out at the end. And now I'm going to put my ruler and get all these marks on the edge here. And then all I'm gonna do is measure up 2¼ inches. Now I'm doing 2¼ inches because the way we're gonna put the bag together, the edges are gonna overlap. So if I want a 4-inch deep gusset, I want a 1/4 inch overlap, so I have to go an extra 1/4 inch. If you're just sewing this together on the center and then you're gonna flip it right side too, you can just do the standard 2 inches or however deep you want your bag. And the last measurement, or the last line we need to draw is our line right here, which will give us our 4-inch depth for our bottom of our bag and our 2¼ inches up. So I made both of these lines 2¼ inches, so all I have to do is I'm gonna go in the middle here and I'm going to line myself up with this line and the bottom line. And I'm going to make one mark, 1, 2¼ inches up here. So I know that this line right here, this line right here, and this are all 2¼ inches. So I can make my final notch there, and then I just do the same thing on the other side as well. The first thing I'm going to do, anytime I cut right angles like this, I like to use, this is just an 1/8 inch punch. I'm actually going to punch a hole in these corners. And the reason for that is when we go in with an X-Acto and we cut, it's going to always, I think it's probably close to impossible to get like an even cut with no overlap, and I don't want anything to rip. So if we punch little holes in the corners here, we can cut from those holes out, and then our leather will go down, have a little rounded part, and go over, have a little rounded part, go up. It'll just prevent any tearing in the future, should that. I don't know how this seam would get pressured in that way, but you never know. So a couple simple holes will make sure that that won't happen. But when I cut out these sides, I'm going to line up my ruler. Instead of just doing the individual sides one at a time, I'm going to line up my ruler on both of them so that I know that if there's a little bit of wiggle or whatever, they're going to be even. And with the holes, it makes this really easy because you can just cut right up to the hole. It gives you a little extra room so you don't have to worry about cutting into the bag. And then we move down and we cut away like that. And we're just going to do that again on this side. And now our last cut is just these 2 little cuts here, and our bag body is completely cut out. In the design here, I'm going to do like this is my personal bag, and I like these really short kind of coal bag style handles, but I know she likes a crossbody thing, so I'm going to do the short coal bag handles that attach to the bag, which we need to put on before we sew anything up, and we're also going to do a little front pocket. Then I'm going to do a separate sort of single crossbody bag. So that's what we're aiming for here. I'm going to make them a little bit shorter than this, and we're only going to do 1 rivet here. So I'm going to measure this just to kind of use as reference because I don't make a ton of bags. So it's always nice to have something that you can measure that you like, you know, where the distance is. I think this can be a little bit lower because this is going to be a smaller bag. So I'm going to measure this up, and then I'm going to cut 3/4 inch straps with our strap cutter. And because this leather is only like 5/6 ounce, I'm going to actually glue 2 pieces together and do 1 single stitch line down the middle, I think, to make our short straps. So when you're doing straps like this, because it's a handhold, I like to take a little extra care and really make sure that I'm rounding them off, because you're going to be, or whoever you're making this for, is going to be kind of holding on to this part, often with weight in it. So it's, you know, you always want to get your all edges kind of nice and rounded and finished, but these I like to make sure that there really are no sharp edges, because it just makes the sort of the user experience a little bit nicer when everything's nice and rounded and smooth and really comfortable to carry. So I burnished these down a bit, and with some gum trag. Now I'm going to use a little bit of beeswax, and I'm really going to get in there on these and make sure these edges are nice and waxed. Just because that'll really seal them up, because they're going to be seeing so much. Their main job is to be touched, essentially. So we're going to make sure everything's real sealed. And all I'm doing is this is just local beeswax from a local beekeeper. And I'm going to go through and I'm going to, almost like you're burnishing, but you're just trying to get a bunch of wax on there. And then I'm going to go through with my cloth, just canvas, and I'm just going to shine that up. And that'll kind of spread it out, heat it up a little bit so it moves around. And it'll get into any leftover little spaces that weren't completely sealed up when you burnished. And it just feels really nice on the hand too. So we have our handles all sewn up, burnished, everything. And remember, if you have thicker leather, you don't have to do the stitching. My personal bag is just like 12-ounce veg tan. But this was only 5-ounce, so I wanted it to be a little bit thicker, and it also just looks really nice stitched. So the next step is we need to attach these to the body of the bag before we sew up the sides. It's just way easier. What I like to do is I like to you can install them like this, but I like to angle them a little bit. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to use 2 brass rivets on each one, and I'm going to do them about 3/4 of an inch apart, and the bottom ones are going to be 6.5 inches separated, and the top ones are going to be 5.5 inches separated. So I'm going to measure all that out. Now, the process we're showing you is just how to make the bag. The measurements are going to be different no matter depending on the size of the bag that you want. So you can scale this up or down however you'd like. So, you know, these measurements aren't gospel for every bag you make. They're just what we're going to go with. So I'm just going to measure those out now on both sides, and we're going to install the handles. So once this first side is done, I'm just going to line everything up very carefully and transfer the marks over to the back of the other side. I like to do it this way instead of putting the new marks on the front of the other side, because if I'm off, which I probably am a little bit on this side, I'll be off in a mirrored way on the other side, so the bag handles will still match up. If I flip the bag over like this, then I'll be mirrored. Say I'm off to the left, it'll be off to the right, and then they'll be all crooked. So I like to do it this way, and then we're just going to punch these holes. The same with our handles. I have one marked out and punched. Make sure they line up on a couple of the sides just to make sure. Then I'm just going to transfer these marks to our second handle, and I'll punch them out, and then use this side to transfer to the other side of the first handle, and then do the same thing again. And this is very much, you know, you're only making one in this size. You're not going to make a pattern. You're just kind of doing it off the cuff. This is how I do it. So I think that I wasn't going to put a front pocket on this, but I think it needs it. I like these with the brass rivets. I think if we do rivets in the corners of a pocket, it'll bring it all together and bring your eye down the bag. So the way I like to do pockets, you gotta be careful not to mount them too low. So what I like to do is I'll measure how far down my my handles end, which is about 1 3/4. Then on the bottom, that means I want my pocket to end a little bit taller than that so that the bag looks like it's sitting at least centered. You just don't want the pocket to look like it's really low. So I'm gonna do 2 inches up from the bottom. So inch and 3/4 plus 2 inches is 3 3/4. This is 9 inches tall. So you subtract 3 3/4 and our pocket is going to be 5 1/4 inches tall. Then I'm gonna do my pocket about as wide as the handles, and that's gonna be we'll say 7.5 inches. So we're gonna do our pocket 5 1/4 inches tall by 7.5 inches wide. Here we go. So our pocket's all cut out. It fits nice. One little trick that I like to do with this style bag, because the bottom is very structured and the top is kind of open. I'll draw this out for you. The bag tends to sit sort of like this when it's all put together and your handles are up here. So what I like to do is I like to take my front pockets, and instead of it being a complete square, I like to take the measurement that I need, cut it out, and then I'm going to take off a little bit to match this shape. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to grab my ruler. Now this is the top of my pocket, and I'm going to put my ruler right at that corner, and then I'm going to go in a 1/2 inch, and I'm just using the grid on my cutting board, and I'm going to cut that off. Let me see if I can do that for you. I'm going to cut that off there, and then I'm going to cut it off over here as well. And what that'll do is, once we have the bag together, and it's sitting like this, instead of our pocket being kind of an odd square shape that there's no other squares in the bag, these corners will come in and kind of go with the side of the bag a little bit more, and it'll look more balanced and like it belongs. So it looks a little weird when you're putting it together, but when it all goes together, I promise you it'll make sense. So I have my pocket finished. I beveled, sanded, burnished everything. I did this stitch line. You want to probably do it before you put it on the bag, before you glue the pocket down, because you don't want to dig into this bag leather with the other side of your divider. That's happened to me a couple times. And I've also marked just little corners you can barely see that'll be covered up by the pocket. So I know exactly where to put it, just to make sure it's centered. Now I'm not going to glue this. I'm going to use our basting tape. It's just a double stick fabric tape. And I'm just going to do a bit on each side, just enough to hold it down. So we'll go there. And I'm going to use this instead of glue because it's not permanent. So if I put it down and I don't like where it is, I can always lift it up and reposition the pocket. It's really important to get this nice and centered because it'll make the whole bag look real weird if it's not centered. So this way we can peel this off, place it down, and before we press it, we can kind of make sure it's perfect, and then we'll stick it down. And once we have this pocket sewn in, we can finally work on getting our sides ready to stitch up. So the way we're going to do this is we're going to fold this over, and this is going to lay, so you can sew them up like this if you want. You can sew them up like this and then do a flip. This is kind of thick leather and I just don't like flipping bags inside out. So I'm gonna do it like this, and then we'll sew this seam on the bottom up on the outside, which is kind of an interesting little detail. Usually you sew it up on the inside and flip it. So first thing we need to do is make our stitch line down the sides. We're gonna do it separately on both, and I'm gonna show you how I do it to make sure that the holes line up, because I'm not gonna glue it. I think I'm just gonna punch the holes on each side and then kind of line them up and sew like that. First thing we need to do, of course, put our stitch line in on all 4 of our sides. And then what we're going to do is to punch things separately and make sure they line up when you put them together. What I like to do is have a point of reference. So this is pretty simple. My point of reference is just going to be the top of our bag. So I'm going to take one of my prongs of my stitching chisel, and I'm just going to like kind of, let me move this so you can see it. I'm going to kind of lock it over the edge, and then I'm going to mark where my first hole is going to go, right? So if I do that on this side and this side, I'll know that if I punch this and put them together, that these are going to line up. And then all I have to do is punch right down the bag. So I'm going to do that on both sides, and then we're just going to stitch it up. It's pretty simple. So all I've done here is I've just used some extra sewing needles to keep this thing held together, and I'm just going to work my way down. And once you get probably just a little tiny bit of the way, we'll flip it on its side and we'll sew kind of from the inside out. This is just a good way to kind of hold everything together initially while you get these first stitches started. And you could glue the seam as well. It's kind of difficult to glue though, so I just always end up doing it like this. And then fairly quickly we're going to go right side up here. I'm trying to figure out the best way to show you on the camera. Once we have both seams sewn up here, take your time. It's a weird angle to sew everything, so take your time, just go at it slowly. The last step to get this bag closed up is we are going to put some glue inside on both of these, and all we're going to do is squeeze that shut, and we're going to sew across here. It'll give it a little bit of unexpected dimension. Most bags are kind of folded inside, so this is just a nice way to add a little extra touch to the bag. So I'm just going to go ahead and glue this up, and then we'll go through and stitch it. So once our glue's dry, I have a little pencil mark here on this leather. It's easy to erase, but use something that you can get rid of. I'm just going to use that center line to make sure that my stitching is lined up and this whole thing is centered. I'm just going to kind of squeeze it, go very slowly, and you might have to come from the inside here to get this lined up. There we go. And now I'm going to go over to our blocks and hammer this down so that we can set this glue. I'm just going to come over and do the same thing on this one. You can see here, you're probably not going to be totally perfect. There's a little overhang here. I didn't trim it. What I'm going to do is I'm just going to make sure that this piece hangs a little bit above this so that when I can trim this whole seam down and it'll all be even. And so again, with my little center mark here, I'm just going to mark that, or line that up. Squeeze this closed. And the hammering on this seam specifically is important because there's a lot of tension going on everywhere. So if you want this nice and glued down, and then stitching will be a breeze if it is. If it's not, you're going to probably have a weird time punching. It comes undone. You just don't want that to happen. So that's hand pressed, and then I'm going to go over. And you can, make sure you push the bag out of the way. Don't worry, you're not gonna wrinkle it or ruin it or anything. And don't be delicate with it. Make sure you're really pressing this down so that we have a nice seam. So before we stitch, I'm not gonna burnish these before everything's stitched up, but I do want to sand this down level. So I did a little bit of trimming just with my X-Acto knife. I just very slowly shave down any overhang. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to sand this down by hand. This is about 220 grit, and I just wrapped it around my lighter to give me sort of a flat surface. You can use like a battery or a little piece of wood, and this is just gonna, because there's a lot of structure to this edge, it's almost more like woodworking right now with the sanding, so we want a little bit of rigidity to make sure that we get this nice and flat. And you can see where we punched the holes. That's why we punched them. Because this is folded, if this were an angle, we could split this, but since it's rounded with the punch, when we sand over it, it's kind of out of the way. And down on this side is the same thing. So that's why we punched those way back in the beginning. It's going to make this last a lot longer because we're not going to have to worry about any leather splitting down the road. So now you got to get creative with your punching setup, but it's pretty much a regular little stitching joint here. I didn't stitch this side seam all the way down so that we don't have any threads crossing over, and you don't want to do any looping around on this edge because this is what's going to be set down on the ground. So you'll cut right through your thread if you do that. But we're just going to lay our stitch line down and then get our chisels and punch these out. And this was our finished bag, but it doesn't really stay closed. I'm thinking, what do you think? I don't know bags that well. Can we put a closure right here?
Yeah, I think it would look good.
All right. So we'll do something like this. We'll just do like a simple snap, kind of like not this wide. It'll be just a little bass snap, and I'll rivet it on the back. But let's get that done, and I think that'll look really nice. So I just used a little piece of scrap, made this little snap flap thing. So So it'll go over. I'm just going to install just a brass snap right here. So it'll hold the bag closed and look all nice. And here we go. So I did just 2 little rivets here and a little snap opening, and you just unsnap it, and it's just a big single pocket, and then it's got the little pocket on the front. If I can, yeah, close it shut like that. And I'm really happy with it. So this design is great. Going about it this way because you can make it any size. You don't need to print out patterns for anything. You can add all sorts of different front pockets. You can see now with it finished, you see how our angled front pocket matches the shape of the bag. If we were to make this square, which the piece of leather was before we stitched it up, it would kind of look a little out of place. With an angle on it, it mirrors these edges here, and it just looks really nice and balanced. So I'm really, honestly, this came out way nicer than I expected it to. I don't really ever make purses, and I guess this is about as much of a purse as you can get. So thank you guys so much for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.